Hey guys, in today's video, we'll go over how to install hinges for 1 3/4 doors. This will include wood doors or aluminum frame doors. Before getting started, we'll go over the components of a hinge kit. You'll receive 2 hinge halves, a hinge pin, a bushing, a hinge backing plate, and as you can see, there are 3 set screws, with one of them being offset. And you'll receive 1-inch taper-headed screws to attach a hinge half to the door. Now, to briefly go over how the hinge will be constructed, we'll take 1 hinge half, we'll put the hinge pin in the hinge half, we'll then put a bushing over the hinge pin, and then we'll connect this hinge half to the door jamb using the hinge backing plate. For the other half of the hinge, we'll be attaching this hinge half directly to the door using the 1-inch taper-headed screws. We'll go over more in detail on how all of this will go together later in this video. The first thing we'll go over is installing the hinge half going onto the door jamb. The first thing we'll need to do is determine the swing of the door. And in this situation, the door is going to be swinging into the room. Therefore, the hinge half will go onto the door jamb and rest against the door jamb. Once we have the hinge half on the door jamb, we can then install the hinge pin. Now, when we're installing the hinge pins, we want to drop the pin in so that it is facing up towards the top of the door jamb. The reason we do this is because when we bring the door with the other hinge half, the hinge half on the door jamb is going to slide into the hinge on the door. But once you determine which way the pin needs to be orientated, we can then drive the pin into the hinge half. Now, on the hinge pin, there's a long side and a short side with knurlings on the pin. When we install the pin, we need to drive the shorter section into the hinge half so that the knurlings go into the hinge half and the pin is flush with the bottom edge of the hinge half. Now, the best way to drive these pins in is with a hammer on a hard surface. So we'll go ahead and install the hinge pin into the hinge half. With the hinge pin installed into the hinge half, we can now attach the hinge half to the door jamb. To do this, take the hinge backing plate and install it into the door jamb, making sure that the holes on the backing plate align with the holes on the hinge half. Once you have the holes aligned, install the set screws through the hinge half and into the backing plate. With the hinge half attached to the door jamb, you can loosen the set screw to move the hinge half up and down on the door jamb. We'll use this when we go to install the hinge halves into the hinge half that is attached to the door. We'll also use this to adjust the height of the door. The last thing we'll need to do is we'll need to put the bushing over the hinge pin. With the hinge half installed on the door jamb, we can now go over installing the hinge half onto the door. Now, before doing so, I want to quickly go over how the hinge half on the door is going to function with the hinge half on the door jamb. When we install the hinge half onto the door, we want to make sure to orientate the hinge correctly on the door so that when we install it onto the hinge pin, it allows the door to open and close properly. Now, this is going to be dependent on the swing of the door, so what I recommend doing is you can mock up the door up to the door jamb to make sure that we orientate the hinge haft correctly so the hinge functions properly. So with that in mind, we'll go over how to attach the hinge haft to the door. With the hinge haft orientation determined, we can now attach the hinge haft to the edge of the door. Now we typically send 3 to 4 hinge kits per door. As a general rule of thumb, any doors that are 7 foot or lower will receive 3 hinge kits, whereas any doors over 7 foot will receive 4 hinge kits. This will come into play when determining the hinge spacing on the door. Now, since the hinges are surface mounted to the door, you essentially can place the hinges wherever you would like on the door. We just try to make sure we evenly space the hinges and that we have the top of the hinge at least 6 inches from the top of the door and the bottom hinge at least 6 inches from the bottom of the door. From there, you can evenly space the hinges in the center. Now, something to keep in mind when determining the hinge spacing is that the hinge haft on the door jamb is going to slide up into the hinge haft on the door. Therefore, when you're determining spacing, you want to make sure that you factor in that other hinge. With the hinge location determined, we can take the hinge haft and attach it to the edge of the door. To do this, take the hinge haft and place it tight to the edge of the door. You can then take a 5/32 drill bit and drill a hole through the center of the hinge haft. What I like to do is I like to pre-drill the hole first, run 1 attaching screw, and then come back and run my 2 other attaching screws. So we'll go ahead and attach the hinge haft to the door. Once you have all the hinge hafts attached to the door, we can then go over how to hang the door on the door jamb. To install the door, place the door next to the door jamb and align the holes and the hinges attached to the door with the hinge that's within the door frame. Once you have the door in the right position, loosen the set screws and slide the hinge pins into the hinge haft on the door. With the hinge pins in the hinge halves on the door is now secured to the door jamb. The last thing we'll need to do is adjust the height of the door. When adjusting the height of the door, we want to make sure we have proper clearance at the floor, and we want to make sure that the top of the door is within the door header. When adjusting the door height, lift the door to the height needed and place a shim under the door. From there, loosen the set screws on the hinges in the door jamb and lift them up into the hinge haft on the door. Once the hinge is in the correct position, you can then tighten all 3 set screws on each hinge. From there, you can remove the shim from the door and make sure the door opens and closes properly. With the door open and closing properly, the installation is complete. This will be the conclusion to the video. If you have any questions, please contact our office.